This has developed into a full-blown obsession. I have to go to this room. I have to. I stole it from the US military. This is a federal crime. I turn on the car and I'm hearing spiritual Sunday music, and I'm like, why are they playing church music on a Saturday? And it wasn't Saturday, it was Sunday. What I thought was an overnight trip to the casino turned into a 36-hour trip to the casino without me even knowing I'd done it. The shock that was in her when I said all this to her will sit with me for the rest of my life. Welcome to Fall In, the problem gambling podcast for military service members and veterans. My name is Dave. I am an 11-year veteran of the United States Army. I am also in recovery for a gambling addiction since January of 2020. And this is my story. Prior to my entry into the military, I would call my life anything but ideal. As a kid, I grew up in an alcoholic home. My mother divorced and then remarried to another alcoholic who also happened to be an abuser. So I learned at an early age to kind of hide from feelings, to kind of hide from being me, basically, and grew up that way, very guarded, kind of very to myself. Got into high school later and moved in with a friend, and my life for a few years became much better for me. It was a much more calm life. It was a much more calm existence. But honestly, I guess the background was already being built to hide from myself. Fast forward a few years, I entered into the Army. Honestly, basic training in the Army was easy for me because I already had the skills of being yelled at through my entire youth and actually got the tar beat out of me multiple times, which never happened in basic training. And once I understood that they were doing it as part of their job, it actually became quite easy for me. And I adjusted pretty quickly because I could compartmentalize my feelings, which I had already been well practiced at doing. I got out of the Army the first time, got married, had two children, and found myself in a situation where honestly I needed to go in the Army again because the job prospects just weren't there for me and my then growing family. I got back into the Army in 1998. Already began having problems with, at the time, my wife. I had two kids, I had a lot happening, and then eventually came down on orders for the Republic of Korea in 2001. Those orders came down early in 2001, so there was a lot of arguing, a lot of prep. There was a lot of talk about getting out of the military versus staying in and being away for a year, because I'd have to spend that year away from my family at home. But ultimately, that's what I ended up doing. And when I left, it was a month and a half after the events of 9/11. So there was a whole lot of additional stress that was thrown on everything that was already happening to me when I left my then first wife and two young children to get on a plane and go to Korea for a year and not knowing what to expect, because at the time the president was calling it the axis of evil. There were a lot of things happening across the world. I just didn't know what to expect. So I was already stressed when I got on the plane. So I did. I got on the plane. I flew the 16 hours to get to Osan Air Base in Korea, landed there in November of 2001. The first thing I noticed as I'm flying in is that there are Patriot missiles pointed at our plane as we're landing. Unnerving to say the least. But we made it to the ground, we made it to our transport and drove the hour or two to get to Yongsan Base, which was in Seoul and at the time was the Central Army headquarters for the Republic of Korea, or what most people call South Korea. So I got in there and they put me up in a very nice hotel. There are hotels scattered throughout military bases across the world that are essentially 4- and 5-star hotels that people can visit. Well, I was put up in one of these. It was called the Dragon Hill Lodge. Went in, dropped all my stuff off in my room, got something to eat. I was very tired, but I wasn't ready to sleep. I was stressed. I didn't know what to expect. There was a lot of fear that was involved there. I got all checked in and I started walking around the hotel and noticing the shops and the different things. And lo and behold, I walk up, and as I'm walking around, I'm hearing these noises. And I walk up and I look in, and there's this room that is a casino style slot machine room right there in the hotel, right there on the military base. I didn't know these existed because they don't exist here in the States. They are put on overseas military bases through the Department of Defense's Morale, Welfare, and Recreation arm as a means to, number one, give people something to do, but also to generate money to fund other morale, welfare, and recreation things like trips and bowling alleys and, excursions and things like that. So I walked in there and I said, you know what? I grew up in Pennsylvania. I was not too far from Atlantic City. I'd gone there in my 20s, had fun. Why not? I pulled out some money and I said, I need to kill some time till I can sleep anyway. So I pulled out a couple $100 and I went into this room and I sat down in front of a machine. One of the first things I noticed is kind of that my shoulders relaxed a little bit. I'm like, okay, this is going to help me to relax to the point where I can get to sleep. It wasn't too long into it that I made what I often describe as the biggest mistake a budding compulsive gambler can make, and I won. It wasn't an amazing amount of money. If it was $2,000, it was a lot, right? So I don't remember the exact amount. I just know it wasn't a ton of money. But here's the important thing to that. In that moment, all of the stress, all of the fear of the unknown, all of the stuff that I carried with me on that plane and from where I left in the at the airport until I got into Korea and until I got into there, in that moment it washed away. It was gone. And in that moment I felt good. I felt as good as I'd felt in a long time. Now, it didn't last forever. In fact, it didn't last super long at all, but it was there. And while I won't say I became an addicted gambler in that moment, what I will say is seed was planted. Because I went on and I played a little bit longer that night and I left and I went to bed and I took money with me when I left, just like I had done when I was younger in Atlantic City. The next day I went in, I finished all the paperwork and processing and getting ready to go to my unit, which was at the southern end of the peninsula in Pusan, where I was to be the non-commissioned officer in charge of my squad and a squad about an hour away in a town called Daegu. I got in the transport, I went down to there, I got settled in, I got set up in my housing, I met the rest of my squads, got settled into my desk, got oriented, took my physical fitness test. The week went by and I got to Friday and I went, okay, I need to relax. I'm going to go to the community club, which is basically the bar and restaurant on post, right? So I went there and I sat down and I noticed in the corner was a small room. So I went to that room and lo and behold, it's another one of these casino style slot rooms right there on the base. Okay, much smaller, much less elaborate, if you will, but nonetheless a room full of machines where people were playing. So I thought, okay, I had fun doing this in Seoul. Let me do this here again because it gives me something to do and something to relax. That one night there and the one day in Seoul, slowly but surely, and I won't even say really slowly because it was probably over the course of about the next 3 months or so, that one night there turned into 2 nights, then turned into 3 nights, then turned into 4 nights. Within a month or two, now I'm going to this room 5 nights a week after work because it's my place to go to get away from everything. At the time, I was getting an allowance. My money would go into an account back in the States. And then my wife at the time would funnel a chunk of money to me monthly into an account I had set up on base. So I'd have access for food and all that sort of stuff. Well, I was starting to pull from that money because that win I had in the beginning, they don't last. If you're consistently going to the casino or consistently betting online, whatever the case might be, more often than not, what happens is those wins start to become losses. And that's what was beginning to happen to me. But at the same time, those losses were starting to pile up. What else was building up was my desire to be in that room because it was moving from this is fun and I like doing this to I kind of need to do this. I kind of want to do this. This is my happy place. This is my place to get away. I want to go here. I need to go here. And then eventually became I have to go here. And that 5 nights a week then becomes six, then becomes seven, then becomes during the day on Saturday and during the day on Sunday. And anytime I can get away, within that first 3 months, now I'm going to this room. And here's the problem. As I'm doing that, the money I'm getting to buy my food and all that, it's gone. It's disappearing, right? But as it's disappearing, the desire to go and the compulsion to go is increasing more and more and more and more. And I don't really know why. And if I'm being honest, at that time, I'm not really paying attention to why. I just know that that's what I need to do. I started to call my wife and give her excuses. Hey, I got this soldier that needs this. Hey, we're going on this trip. Or hey, I need extra money for this, which then gave me, of course, extra money to go back to the room with. And eventually that would run out and I would come up with more excuses. And then eventually she started to say, no, you really don't need all this money. What's going on here? So that dried up. That stopped happening. I stopped getting that extra money, from her. And then because this compulsion was building and the need was still there and growing day after day after day, I then took all of the things that I brought with me. I was there for a year. So I brought a really expensive 10-speed bike. I brought electronic equipment and all this sort of stuff with me. Well, I sold it all. I got rid of it all. So I would have money to continue feeding this room. Now my mind's telling me you're going to get it back. Don't worry. You're going to win it back. It's not going to be that big of a deal. Just keep doing it. So I sold off all my stuff, right? Had a bed to sleep in. I still had access to food, so I could survive. And sure enough, that money disappeared very quickly because that's not being replenished. That's a one-time thing. You sell it, you get the money, it's gone, that's it. By now, this has developed into a full-blown obsession, right? I have to go to this room. I have to. I can't get through a day without going to this room because it's my place to offload. It's my place to be free. It's my place to escape, whatever you want to call it. The drive and the pull to go to this room was so strong I couldn't avoid it, even though logically and intelligently in my head, I knew what I was doing was dangerous. I knew it. I didn't know why. I didn't know all the wherefores and why as to why it was dangerous. I just knew it was. But yet I kept doing it. I could not stop doing it. So this continued to go on and got worse and worse and worse. And while all this is going on, I'm developing soldiers and I'm helping to get them promoted. I developed a packing and training system for field. You know, we would go to the field and I developed a system that our unit commander and Sol was so liked so much, he asked if he could borrow from it and send it around the peninsula. I got my expert field medical badge, which is a terribly, terribly difficult badge in the Army to get. At the time, I want to say it was a 16% first time go rate to get this badge, and I got it the first time around. So all these good things are happening right alongside this compulsion and obsession to want to go to this room and to gamble. We get to the middle of the tour, and in the middle, there was always a mid-tour leave. So I got to go home for 30 days, back to my wife, back to my kids. And honestly, I didn't gamble for 30 days. The thoughts weren't even there because I was spending time at home. I was able to see my kids. I was doing normal home things, right? Get to the end of those 30 days, I get back on the plane. I'm back in Korea. And by this time, I had stopped thinking about gambling. I'm like, okay, I'm feeling pretty good now. I get off the plane back in Korea. And the very first thing I wanted to do was go back to that room. It's so weird how that just automatically snapped into place the minute I walked into that environment. I don't know if it was the stress. I don't know if it was just the lure now of that escape. I'm not sure what it was. It just was instant. So of course I started going back, and I had access to money because I'd been away 30 days. So I'd been building up money over those 30 days. Not long before that money was gone though. So then over the course of the last 5 months or so of my time in Korea is when serious damage started to be done. Because I was so obsessed at going to this place, now I started doing things that were out of the character that I wanted to be. I was so proud of being a non-commissioned officer. I was so proud of my time in the Army. I was so dedicated to my job and what I was doing, but yet I was doing things that were out of character. I was telling my officer in charge I had non-commissioned officer meetings on post in the middle of the day, and I was going to the room in the middle of the day. My lunch breaks, I was going there. 7 days a week, I was going there. Saturdays and Sundays, I was going there. And of course, that money ran out very, very quickly. So I made the first mistake of two major blunders that I did while I was in Korea that to this day I can't even stand talking about, but have to because it's important. The first of which was borrowing money from my subordinates. If you know anything about being a leader in the military, a non-commissioned officer, a petty officer in the Navy, whatever it is, you don't do that. You don't do that because these are people you're supposed to be setting the example for, being the leader for, guiding. And yet here I am borrowing money from them. That went on for a little while. I did pay them back and I did stop borrowing from them. But the fact of the matter is, it never should have happened in the first place. But I was so obsessed to go to this room, I couldn't help myself. So fast forward a couple of months, and we're getting now closer to the end of my 1 year tour. We're moving more into the fall of 2002. I was so obsessed at that point that I made the second of my major blunders, and this one was a big one, is I stole money from my unit's petty cash fund. I knew right where it was. I had access to it because I was the non-commissioned officer in charge. And I walked in there and I'm saying to myself, you know what? I'm going to win it and put it back. That's what my mind's telling me, right? My mind is saying to me, you're going to win it. You're going to put it back. Don't worry about it. You're going to be okay. Meanwhile, the intellectual part of me, right? The rational side of my brain is going, you idiot. No, you're not. because I was at the point when whenever I walked into that room, I knew I would walk out with nothing, even if I won. I knew it. I knew that's what was going to happen because that's how bad this addiction had become by that point. So naturally, I walked in with this petty cash money. Again, it was not a whopper, it was not a large sum of money, but it doesn't matter. I stole it from the US military. This is a federal crime. This is on a military installation. And I stole this money. I go to the game room and I'm like, yeah, I'm going to win it back. I'll put it back and then I'll keep whatever's left and it'll allow me to come back here. Well, of course, I walked out of there with nothing. And it wasn't very long before our officer in charge noticed it missing, called the Criminal Investigation Division, the CID, who then initiated an investigation. And I did not allow that investigation to go very far before I said, we need to talk. And I sat down in that room and I confessed everything that I had done because I felt so shameful about the actions that I had taken that I had to say something. The part of me that was honorable, the part of me that wanted to be a non-commissioned officer, the part of me that was engaged in doing my job could not allow this to linger. I wasn't going to hide from it. So I admitted it. Immediately, I was pulled from my position, and rightly so. And then shortly after that, I was sent back to Seoul. I had about a month left before the end of my tour. I was sent back to Seoul to face the music, right, for what I had done. I got down there, they put me into an administrative role where I was filing paperwork and cleaning places and just giving me things to do while they figured out what to do with me. And I remember during that time, while I was there, I'm sitting down with my commander, who was a colonel. One of the people in my Army career that I respect, he probably has just about the highest level of respect I could give to any person in the military. I gave to this colonel because of who he was and the way he operated. Well, he sat me down across from his desk and he looked at me and he said, honestly, we don't know what to do with you. He said, you're doing all of these great things. You've done all of these great things. And then there's this gambling thing, this money thing. And I say that because it showed the lack of understanding of gambling as an addiction, which I also experienced at the same time because I agreed with him at that point. It was a money thing, right? It wasn't a gambling thing. It was a money thing. Yes, I gambled, but it was about the money. I got reduced by one rank and then I was able to be sent on to my next unit. Well, from there, I went to my first sergeant, who's my enlisted person in charge, and got my end of year non-commissioned officer evaluation, which was mostly top scores. I got very good scores in most categories, with the exception, I think, of character, I think it was. And again, there was the money, the theft, all that sort of thing, but there was no talk of the addiction and the gambling. And again, no fault of theirs. It's lack of understanding is really what it was. I was let go from Korea in November of 2002, one rank lower than what I was before, and then sent on to my next unit. Over the next few years, it did not get better. I got into South Carolina. I was a couple months later reunited with my family. And now, at the time in South Carolina, there were no casinos where I was stationed or where I was living. So I got hooked on lottery. And started to dig into that. And by now, when I didn't have money, I would go out to all of these little places where you could get these very high interest personal loans, and I start taking out personal loans. I get a second job, and I'm telling my wife, yeah, I just want to get a second job, bring in some extra money for me to spend for fun things and that sort of thing. Well, I was spending it all on the gambling where I was spending it. It got to the point where number one, my wife had taken the kids up to see family in Pennsylvania, and I was there because I was still working. Well, one Saturday, I wanted to find a casino because I hadn't been to one since I was in Korea, and the only one I knew of was 6 hours away on the other end of the state. So I got into my vehicle. I took a couple $100 with me. I drove 6 hours to the other side of the state to go to this casino. I was there for maybe 3 hours and was broke. Then drove all the way back to where I was living, took out a quick loan, grabbed a couple hundred more bucks, drove the 6 hours back there, and within an hour that money was gone again, and then drove back, of course, depressed, dejected, let down because I couldn't walk out of there with anything. I had to walk out with zero. During that time in South Carolina, I also experienced the first of 4 attempts on my own life. I was sitting at my office at work. I was so distraught over the fact that these thoughts were constant in my head now. They wouldn't go away. They were always there. I didn't know where they were coming from. And honestly, I didn't think anybody could ever possibly understand them. So I didn't know that I could escape from it because I didn't know how, because I didn't think anybody could help me. So I had pills for my back because I've had a bad back for many, many years. So I just took pretty much all of them. And the next thing I know, I'm on the floor in my office. And then the next thing I know after that, I'm waking up in the hospital with my wife on one side of me and my boss on the other side. And my boss saying to me, "You're going to go see a counselor." Okay. I was not stationed on a military base at the time. We were satellite. So I found a civilian counselor. My wife insisted on going with me. So she would sit in there with me. And I basically told the counselor what I thought the counselor wanted to hear, get through the session so I could move on and get back to gambling. I was not ready. This continued to go on until I came down on orders now to go from South Carolina to Texas. By the way, I'd gotten promoted in the meantime, right? But things had gotten so bad between me and my wife, and she didn't fully understand what I was doing because I was able to hide most of what I was doing from her, which, by the way, is very common in this addiction. Pretty much hid most of it. But she knew I wasn't there. I was distracted. I was fighting and arguing with her most of the time. So she made a decision in that moment that when I went to Texas, she was not going with me. She was going to stay in South Carolina, and essentially we were going to be separated. And I had to leave my two young children with her in South Carolina. From a safety standpoint, they were well cared for. I didn't worry about that, but I just didn't get to see them. Right. And that tore my heart apart, but I knew it was the right thing to do. So I get down to Texas, I get settled in. Once again, I'm the non-commissioned officer in charge. But because now I'm separated from my family and I have all these stresses going on, of course, I went right back to it. And it got bad again to the point where, again, I stole from my own unit. And this time it wasn't money. This time it was electronic equipment, which I then pawned and went out and gambled with. And again, an investigation was started. And again, I confessed. Well, in the meantime, after the confession and before anything else happened, I'm sitting in my room, the room they had me in, which was a brick wall room. Again, so distraught because I thought nobody's going to figure this out. Nobody's going to know how to help me, that I basically cleared a path from one end of the room to the other. I put my head down and I drove my head first into that other wall as quickly as I could, as many times as I could, until basically I was so out of it, I couldn't do it anymore. Obviously failed at taking my own life, but then ended up taking myself to the Navy hospital, telling them I'd tried to hurt myself, which landed me in a civilian acute psych ward in the area where I was stationed. For 2 weeks, I was here. While I was there, my officer in charge and my commander, a lieutenant colonel, show up into the conference room of this acute psych ward. And basically, I got punished again. This time I was being told that I was being let out of the Army. Rightly so. I was impacting readiness. I was impacting my unit's ability to do their job. But again, no talk of the addiction, no talk of gambling, no talk of, mental health. It's just you did these things. However, the colonel did say to me, "We're letting you out under honorable conditions so you can go get the help you need." I guess as I look back, the question there is, what help did I need? Because at the time I didn't know. I had no clue. So I was let out of the Army this was in 2005. I made my way back to Pennsylvania with a stop in South Carolina along the way to see my children because my ex and I were still speaking. We hadn't been divorced yet. We were still speaking, and she wanted me to see my kids. So I at least got to stop and see them and then drove up to Pennsylvania where I was staying with family here in PA, my home. Got settled in, went out, found a job, started making money, and very quickly found the casinos in PA where I was. Wasn't long before I was again fully engaged. And between July of 2005, when I got there, and June of 2007, when I finally sought real help, I did so much damage, I can't even begin to describe what that damage was. I stole, again, this time from a civilian employer. I went through 5 different jobs because these jobs were getting in my way of my ability to gamble. I lied. I manipulated. I took a car from my mother because mine got repossessed because I wasn't paying the bills. So I took her and she allowed me to do it. She just wants the best for her kids. Even though she knew I was damaging myself, she wanted the best for me. So she was basically an enabler. She enabled me to do it. And I took advantage of that. I took full advantage of that. Meanwhile, during all of this, 2 more suicide attempts, both with medication, both with pills, both landed me in the VA hospital. No, actually, one of them landed me in a civilian hospital. That's a whole story in and of itself. It was a Friday night. I had just gotten paid from my job. I took out, I think it was $500, and I drove down to what at the time was my favorite casino outside of Philadelphia here in Pennsylvania. And I was like, all right, here we go. I'm going to walk out of here a millionaire. Even though I knew in my mind, once again, I wasn't. So I walked in there on a Friday night and I started gambling. And not long into it, boom, I hit, and I made a bunch of money. Well, that allowed me to just extend my time there gambling. So I did. I gambled and I gambled and I gambled and I kept going until eventually I dwindled down to the point where had not that much money left. And I've heard other people say this, but I've experienced this for myself. I couldn't wait to run out of money so I could leave. I couldn't wait to run out of money so I could leave, but I wouldn't leave until I ran out of money. Well, eventually, of course, I did run out of money, and it was morning by then. So I'm like, okay, I've been here overnight. I've won some money. I lost all my money. Let me go home. I'm dejected. I'm ashamed, like I always am when I leave the casino. I get out to my car. I turn on the car and I'm hearing spiritual Sunday music. And I'm like, why are they playing church music on a Saturday? And it wasn't Saturday, it was Sunday. So what I thought was an overnight trip to the casino turned into a 36-hour trip to the casino without me even knowing I'd done it. I was so dejected at that point. I drove back home, which was about an hour away. I parked in the parking lot of my local grocery store and I just sat there contemplating what I wanted to do. Well, what I ended up doing is I happened to have a bottle of antidepressants there with me, and of course I took them. For me to end my own life, that was one of the worst ways I could have possibly done it, because had the seizures kicked in, it would have been violent. I ended up turning myself into a local civilian psych ward, civilian hospital psych ward, because I realized at that point I wasn't trying to end my life. I was screaming for help. I was screaming for somebody to understand what was going on with me, and nobody did. Nobody did. So I put myself into that hospital overnight. I got to drink charcoal slurry, which again, I don't recommend for anybody. I was there overnight, woke up in the morning and realized I had another paycheck in my mailbox that was coming to me. I think it was from an old job because I had just changed over jobs. So of course I checked myself out of the hospital against medical advice. I don't know how I did it, but somehow I got out of that hospital. I drove back home. I took the check out of the mailbox. I cashed the check. I drove back to that same casino the next day, and within 2 hours, that money was gone. And that's when I knew I had to let go. I had to find something. So I had been going to the VA to try and seek help for this, and got a lot of advice about relationships and about different things, but nobody had talked to me about gambling. Well, on one of my visits, one of the counselors reached down at her desk and she pulled out this almost dusty packet of paperwork, like stapled together paperwork that said Department of Veterans Affairs Gambling Treatment Program. So by now I was so desperate, I just called the number that was on there. She didn't help me set it up or anything. She just gave it to me. So I called the number and sure enough, I got a hold of somebody. This was in 2007. They got me a bed. Not even a month later, they got me a bed. So in June of 2007, I drove out there to Cleveland from my home in PA. It was about a 6 to 7 hour drive. And of course, along the way, I stopped and gambled as a last hurrah. Well, I got there. I got in, I got weighed, I got checked in. By the way, I'm 6'1" and normally run somewhere from 190 to 200 pounds. I was 160 pounds soaking wet when I walked in there. If you think gambling addiction doesn't cause physical effects, I'm here to tell you it does. So I get in there, I get all checked in, and I finally get in front of a counselor for the first time, and they start talking to me. And for the first time in 6 years, somebody spoke a language that made sense to me. They talked about gambling addiction. They talked about the signs and symptoms of it. They told me the damage it can do, but they also told me it's treatable and that I'm in the right place. For the first time in 6 years, I felt hope, like, wow, maybe I really can get better from this. And I spent 28 days there in an inpatient program. During that 28 days, we were required to go to Gamblers Anonymous meetings, a 12-step meeting, which they had one right there on the VA campus. So I get to my first GA meeting and I sit in there, and of course I'm so skeptical. I'm thinking, okay, we're going to hold hands, we're going to sing Kumbaya, and everybody's going to be joyous and happy. Well, that's not the way it went. We read out of a book for a while, which is part of the process. And then we got to where people started to talk about the topic of the day. And the first person got up and they started talking. And I'm like, how the hell do they know about me? Because they started saying things that I could instantly connect with and get. And then the next person got up and started talking. And I was like, wait a minute, how did they know about me too? And in that moment on that day, I had my first exposure to the power of connection in addiction recovery. just how powerful being around other people who are struggling with something similar can be in helping me in my own recovery. I went on, I finished the 28 days. I finished an extended program there and was actually in Cleveland from June of 2007 until just around Memorial Day of 2009. Got a job, stayed in recovery, was doing really well, was going to Gamblers Anonymous meetings, and started to feel really good. I had no urges to gamble. I was engaged in my job. I was enjoying life. I had money. I was going back to school. I was actually getting back in and resuming college. So all of these good things were happening. So I thought, you know what? Not sure I really need these meetings anymore. I'm not sure I need this counseling anymore. I think I'm cured. That's the worst thing somebody in recovery for this addiction can say to themselves, in my opinion. And I'm not the only one that has this opinion, I can tell you that. Once I let go of all the things that were keeping me healthy, the old habits began slowly but surely to creep back in. The desire to hide things, the desire to not want to share those deeper parts of myself, the fear of, oh, this is being done to me, not just happening. So slowly but surely that began to creep back in. Meanwhile, I finished my time in Cleveland. I moved back to Pennsylvania. I kind of took me a while to really get established when I got back home here in Pennsylvania, but eventually I connected with the woman who is my wife now. It's important to note, by the way, during all this, I lost contact with my children for 2 years, not one word to my kids for 2 years. And there were days that I literally cried my eyes out about that because there was never a day I didn't think about them. But my ex at the time had in South Carolina was able to legally take away my parental rights. So if I had ever tried to get a hold of them, I literally could be arrested for it, which was stressful for me. And at the same time, if I'm being honest, was almost relieving because I was so lost at the time that I thought I could never be a good father for my kids, as lost as I was in that moment. So when I got back to Pennsylvania, during that time, I was able to reconnect with my children. I did start to have conversations with them again. And what a joy. The first time I talked to them, I'm on the phone with them and I'm literally trying not to let them know that I'm crying while I'm talking to them. But at the same time, slowly but surely, my desire for old habits is creeping back in. So I get back to Pennsylvania, I'm settled in, it's been a little while, and now I connect with the woman who's now my wife, who, by the way, also was my high school sweetheart many, many years prior. We reconnected and we realized very quickly how much we hit it off and how connected we really were. It wasn't long before we were again dating, which was in 2011. And by 2014, we got married. We got married in October 2014. Here's the thing. During that time, very slowly but very surely, old habits were creeping back in. I had a credit card I didn't tell her about. I spent money on that credit card and bought her dinners and we did cool things together. But because I didn't tell her about the credit card, I needed to pay it off. So in order for me to pay it off and not tell her I had the credit card, I'm taking out small loans now to pay off the credit card. So now the credit card's paid, but now I have this loan sitting here. Logically, it doesn't make sense. But to me, to the gambler's mind, I'm like, oh no, I'll get it fixed. I'm not worried about it. It'll get fixed. Now this loan's sitting here. Now I'm borrowing from this loan to pay off this loan. And now here's the credit card. So now I take the credit card and pay this loan back off, which then puts me back in debt with the credit card. So all I'm literally doing is buying time, but slowly but surely incurring more and more and more and more debt. Until a couple years into our relationship after our marriage, she had gone away. Now, mind you, in the meantime, I bought a new vehicle and completely paid it off. All of these good things were happening. Fast forward, she takes off on a trip to go visit her son down in Texas. And I'm so much in debt, I just want to wipe it clean so that by the time she comes back, I put it behind me. She never knows what happened and I can move on. So, of course, what does dummy me do? I take the title of my truck and I basically buy my own truck back from me through a title loan. I get a hold of about 20 grand. I go down to a casino and it wasn't even 5 hours later that money was gone. I fell right back into old habits. And believe me, it doesn't build back up again. It doesn't. It basically picked up right where it left off. It became obsessive very quickly. There were times during that 5 hours there, I could have walked out with the money I needed to get myself where I needed to be. But I thought if I can get this far, I can get more and get more and get way ahead. It's not logical. This obsession, this disease is not logical. Well, that sparked off a series of events over the next few months that got progressively and rapidly worse. right? Now I had all this debt that I was in, but now I didn't even have the money because now I also have to pay off the truck that I just, bought for myself. So now I'm in desperation mode. And now I'm on social media seeing these online philanthropists who are telling me, we can help you get out of debt. We can help you with this. Well, from there, I got myself scammed and got several $1,000s even more into debt. Now, mind you, all this time, I have not touched our money at home that we had been making from our jobs to pay our bills and do all these things. Well, now it reached a point where I did start tapping into it. Now I had to. Fast forward, we get to the end of 2019. I'm so desperate at that point that I'd been carrying a knife around in my pocket that I got through, it was American Legion or somebody. I sharpened it on my stone wheel downstairs. I had it in my pocket. And if she had ever found out the things I'd been hiding from her for all these years, I had a plan in place to walk to the back of my property, and I had my exit plan well in place. Got through 2019 and into the start of 2020. It was January 3rd, 2020. It was a Friday. I said to my wife, I'm sick. I don't want to get you sick. I'm going to sit here on the couch. I spent the entire weekend on that couch to make the decision whether I wanted to end it all and just be done with all this misery that I've been going through for so many years, or whether I wanted to finally step into treatment, really, really step into treatment and become the person I was hoping to be, knowing that if that's the decision I made, that things could get hairy real quick with my wife because she knew nothing of what I had done. Nothing. I hid everything from her. And there are people who would say, yeah, they know. No, she didn't know. And she's savvy. She's pretty smart, but she had no clue what I had been doing. So on Monday, January 6th of 2020, I went out to my local VA. I said to them, I think I need to be checked in because I want to hurt myself, but I need to make a phone call before we move forward. So I handed them my vehicle keys. I walked outside, I called my wife, and I told her as much as I could of what I had done over that period of time. There are a few periods in my life that I will never forget as long as I live. That's one of them. To hear the person who, for the last 9 years, had unconditionally trusted me in everything that I had said, to hear her voice and the shock that was in her when I said all this to her will sit with me for the rest of my life. It was a knife that I put into my own back. It was a knife I put into her back, right? And I'll never forget it. So I checked myself in January 6th of 2020. It was about a week there. During that week, I got myself back into the gambling treatment program, which had moved now from Brecksville, Ohio to actually Cleveland, Ohio. I called the director, whom I know, and I said, I need to get back in. And she was able to get me a bed. Meanwhile, I also established myself with a Gamblers Anonymous meeting local to me here, to which I'm still going to, by the way, to this day. But I'll get into that in a minute. I got a bed at the gambling treatment program, and February of 2020, I went out to Cleveland again, this time with no money, this time with no access to money, except for the gas in the vehicle to get out there. I got out there, and not long into it, my counselor asked me, what do you want from this program? So first and foremost, I want to stop this destruction. I said, I think, but more importantly, I want to understand what's beneath the destruction so I can start to untangle that and better understand me. I think that was the start of an amazing journey because I spent the next 5 weeks there. When I left there after 5 weeks, I had so much better of an understanding of myself, I think, than I have in my entire adult life, that it was a pretty amazing thing. I also then, by that point, became willing. It's so amazing. When I first got to that program, I was deathly fearful of coming home and seeing all my stuff on the porch and knowing my relationship was going to be over. That was my number one driving fear going out there. Within a couple of weeks, that changed. And it became, I need to focus on me and my recovery. If I go home, and if all my stuff's on the porch, and if my relationship and my marriage is done, I'm going to be very sad. I'm going to be devastated. And yet at the same time, I'm going to accept it because I need to do this for me, for nobody else but me. And I think that was a turning point, a changing point in my life, because I started to become more willing to get uncomfortable. I started to become more willing to let go of pieces of me I wasn't willing to let go before. So I made it through that program. I got out, and by now, COVID's, of course, into full swing. So now I get home. Now I'm doing online gambling support meetings 3, 4, 5 days a week while I'm working from home, right? Which doesn't give me access to anything, which is great. But in the meantime, I got exposed to a podcast hosted by a very good friend of mine, Brian, All in the Addicted Gamblers podcast, where we got to come on and do therapy meetings where we spoke about topics, and I got to get on and tell my story. And from there, I was like, can I do something like this for military service members and veterans? And Brian was like, yeah, let's do it. And from there, this podcast, Fall In, came. That's where it was born, was in that moment. So I started that. I started going to Gamblers Anonymous meetings, which like I said, I go to now every single Wednesday whenever I'm here because I travel a lot telling my story. Then I started writing my book, Fall In, a Veteran with a Gambling Addiction. One of the most therapeutic things I've ever done, because I had written a book a few years earlier called Be Happy with Crappy, which was about my journey, but I never really peeled back the layers of what was beneath it. In Fall In, I was able to dig deep and really start to understand what was behind all this, which for me, not for everybody, but for me was important to understand. So I started writing that book. I started using my education in social sciences and my background in what I'd been through, and I started working with people at an inpatient drug and alcohol facility because I told my wife coming out of this that none of the debt that I incurred for gambling was going to get paid off by our regular job. So I went out and got a part-time job at this inpatient facility. I'm so grateful I did because number one, not only did it allow me to pay off all my debts, and by the way, much quicker than I thought it would, but it also gave me the introduction to a world that has been so cathartic for me. I can't even describe it because now I work for a telehealth group where I get to work with people every single day who went through similar journeys to what I went through. And I get to share my experience and my education to help guide them and hopefully give them a path that they can step down and get better for themselves. So I started to do that as well. So who am I today? Today, I'm back to being happily married. Yes, my wife still doesn't trust me with money, and I'm grateful for that. She holds all the money, and that's how I want it. But we're happy together. My children, who I lost contact with for 2 years, are now both adults. One of them lives 10 minutes away with my 3 grandchildren, and the other lives in my house while he's looking for a place and a job because he had just moved up this way from another place. But I have wonderful relationships now with both of them. I'm now a speaker. I speak across the country, and I tell my story in different congressional briefs, and I tell my story to different clinical groups and different advocacy situations where I'm able to talk about this and help raise awareness. I can't even describe the number of different things. I'm now a member of the board of directors for the National Council on Problem Gambling. I never, ever thought I'd be in this position. Never. If you'd asked me 5 years ago, would you be on the board of directors for the National Council on Problem Gambling? I'd have said, you're nuts. Well, now here I am, right? Now I get to share my story. Now I get to hopefully use the things that I've gone through and the joy that I've been able to experience to help others know that there's hope. And really, isn't that what this is about, right? I wrote this, the very first line and the very last line of my book are, this is a story of hope. Well, that's what this is, right? Strip away all of the devastation, all of the ugliness in the middle of it, and get to the end of it. And this is a story of hope because I learned I'm not alone. I don't have to be alone. And that what I struggled with is treatable. Am I ever going to be cured? No, unlikely. And for anyone struggling with this disease, if you think you're going to be cured, that's a lofty expectation. However, it is treatable and you can live with this for the rest of your life without ever gambling again. The work gets easier. Right? The work gets easier as you go along. To anyone out there who's might be listening to this or watching this and saying to themselves, I'm struggling and I don't know what to do, there's help out there and available, right? If you're feeling you want to do damage to yourself, please call 988. If you call 988 and you're a veteran, press 1. If you're struggling with a gambling addiction and just need some guidance, call 1-800-GAMBLER. If you need help, call 1-800-GAMBLER. Most states in the US have a council, either a council on compulsive gambling, a problem gambling council, or a coalition on problem gambling, that if you look it up online, they have resources for you to be able to get to treatment. There are places offering treatment at no cost across the country. I work for one of them. Know that you're not alone. Know that we're here for you. Know that there is hope. And I'm a living breathing example of that hope, and I'm not the only one, and reach out. That's my story. Thank you.